Okay, so it looks like we're good. And we'll just yeah, all right. We are live, Kevin Blanchard from LGBTQIA in disaster risk reduction. Thank you for coming on with me to kind of chat about this. I don't know if it's an initiative or a project or an organization, but you've at least got a Twitter Twitter handle
Yep.
at LGBTQIA in DRR being disaster risk reduction.
Yep.
So why don't you kind of just give us a little bit of background on you and kind of how this got going?
Sure. So thank you so much, Brad, for letting me speak with you today. I'm Kevin Blanchard. I'm director of an organization called DRI Dynamics, which is a research organization focused on the inclusion of marginalized groups within disaster risk reduction. And it was formed back in 2014. And kind of as I've mentioned, its kind of primary focus is to ensure that marginalized groups, those groups who are kind of traditionally left out of the process of developing policy or practice in disaster risk reduction, have a seat at the table. It's shocking when I'm sure yourself as an emergency manager, and I'm sure everyone kind of watching today will. They won't be shocked, even though it is quite shocking. They won't be shocked at the lack of diversity and representation and visibility of marginalized groups within that process. It tends to be, a very kind of top-down approach, and the goal of DRI Dynamics is really to try and equal that out and allow marginalized groups, those groups who are most impacted by disasters, space to, share their concerns, share their capacities, the knowledge they hold, and discuss vulnerabilities and how vulnerability within those particular communities can really be a driver of some very serious issues and problems that we need to recognise as a DRR and emergency management community. So I've been doing that since 2014. The LGBTQI plus and DRR initiative really came about. So just for clarification, it's not a company. It's just a Twitter account I set up because last year, myself and a colleague, Holly Segler, launched a report around LGBTQI plus people in disasters, and kind of through the development of that report, it was shocking how little work there was being done on policy development within member state governments. Around the issue of gender and sexual minorities and how they are impacted by and recover from disasters. And so to kind of try and, in a very small way, combat some of that kind of lack of recognition and lack of visibility, I set up the Twitter account just to share, research, peer-reviewed journal pieces, news stories, etc., that kind of discuss, the key components of a disaster, the kind of the disaster cycle, but with an LGBTQI plus focus. So that's how we've got to where we are.
And so it's kind of taking the work you're already doing in DRR Dynamics and then kind of disseminating information that's specific to LGBTQIA out through this Twitter channel. And that, I guess, is for also because I know you're part of a huge academic network. And so I would imagine there's a lot of people tracking what's coming out of your work around the world through these different kind of communication channels.
Yeah, I mean, it's and this is the thing, I should probably clarify at this early point that there are a whole host of academics, scholars, professors, kind of researchers who are out there doing work on gender and sexual minorities in disasters. I think what the Twitter account tries to do, and kind of what we as an organization, DRI Dynamics, are trying to do, is kind of democratize that information in some way, because as I'm sure everyone on this call will know, peer-reviewed academic papers usually are behind paywalls. they are expensive to access, unless you have some kind of institutional, login details. They really are very expensive to access, and trying to share that kind of information that's out there and kind of bring to the fore some of the discussions that are happening around this area, I think is something that's really important. And yeah, I mean, it helps that Twitter and other avenues have allowed me to build this network of people who are interested in inclusive DRR, and hopefully we'll share the message.
So that kind of sounds to me like, I'm always fascinated by the tech industry, and I don't know if you're familiar with GitHub or Thingiverse.
GitHub, I've kind of heard of. I wouldn't be able to tell you what they do. Like, if you were to test me now, I wouldn't know.
Yeah,
I've heard of them though.
Yeah, like GitHub is a basically a repository where different people and it started out like software developers would be able to go and put all of the code and programs, Python code, all that code in kind of one centralized repository.
Sure.
And then people could go to their profile and get that code to add to other projects because the person spent the time working on it. But now it's kind of turned into like, people will use GitHub for 3D modeling files. They'll use it for just, like video, people that teach others how to do video production. They'll host all of their instructions and some of their documentation on there. And so it like that, when you were talking, it kind of reminded me of that idea, democratizing and making, the work that you're doing like open source, really.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably a much less kind of technologically advanced version of that. It's just it's using a Twitter account to to take information that is out there.
Yeah.
But just try and share that information for people who might not have seen that, and this is the thing, like a lot of, particularly on the LGBTQI plus and DRR Twitter channel, there are a lot of people who haven't really engaged with this area before. They might not identify as themselves being in the queer community or the gender minority community, but actually, their research somehow kind of skirts around that area or kind of has some indirect involvement. And this is kind of a way for them to start to understand, okay, what is out there and what gaps exist, and what can we as DRR emergency management professionals do to better kind of include that particular community within our work.
Yeah. And so was this like a result of, your findings, like, LGBTQIA over other sort of groups? Like, this was kind of a priority area, or there was a high need?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where I think hopefully every person working in this particular sector is doing that job because they want to help people in times of crisis. I think that's kind of the driving force that really is behind all of this work, all of what we do as professionals. And I think most people understand that there are parts of the community or society within general in the aftermath of disaster that are more impacted than others, just because of cultural, societal, economic systems that kind of are sat outside of the specific work we do, but obviously have huge impacts on the work we do as well. And I think the importance of kind of recognizing that and driving that forward is something that I particularly have been interested in since I finished my degrees. I wouldn't say there's a particular need to focus on any one particular marginalized group. I think all marginalized groups are absolutely need further engagement, further visibility, inclusion, etc. The LGBTQIA plus component, as I said, was a kind of a direct result of the report that I had done with my colleague, but also just in the, there seemed to be a lack of visibility of the research that was happening already. And we as, academics and researchers, etc., can only kind of fill in the gaps that exist in that research if we know what research is already existing, if that makes sense. So
Yep.
it was kind of, this kind of, not a call to action, because that sounds kind of really corny, but it was, partly, okay, this is what's out there. I'm going to start tweeting about research and pieces of policy that are out there. We as a community then need to identify what needs to be done next to make sure that we are moving this forward as a process and as an idea.
Right. So what are some of the like what are some of the things you're working on in this subject that, like, you could say, you know what, we are taking action and we are starting to see results? Is there anything right now that you're particularly involved in?
Yeah. So there's a kind of a really really interesting. I wouldn't even call it an initiative. So it's there's under the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is, for those of you who don't know, is kind of the central UN office that looks at disaster risk reduction and emergency response, etc. They have something called a stakeholder engagement mechanism. It's known as an SEM or SEM. And this kind of group of kind of constituencies, they're known as, it's basically there to represent, the stakeholders who are engaged in the process of international disaster risk reduction. So it would be, people like NGOs, those people who have a focus on people with disabilities, private sector, women and girls. There'll be kind of lots of constituencies within that SEM that are focused on very specific areas of DRR policy and practice. And what we noticed was that there's no specific constituency currently for gender and sexual minorities. And obviously, if we look at the research that's out there already, as I've kind of covered at the beginning of the call, gender and sexual minorities are some of the most marginalized, are some of the most vulnerable, but they also have huge amounts of capacity and knowledge to bring to the table. You only need to look at the way the community, the LGBTQI plus community, comes together in the aftermath of a disaster, as we saw yesterday in Oslo. There was a terrorist shooting, 2 people were killed, but the community as a whole came together in solidarity and marched, to say, we are here, this won't stop us. And there's this kind of this community network within this particular part of society that, as DRR professionals and emergency practitioners, we should be looking at, we should be saying this is something that we want to duplicate across the board, because, if a community responds together, that's always going to be better than an individualistic response to a disaster. The UNDRR stakeholder engagement mechanism is really trying to identify, how we as a group, as a community of sexual and gender minorities, can contribute to the process of developing policy on an international level and developing, a way forward to acknowledge the skills and the attributes and the vulnerabilities that this particular community brings to the overall process.
So part of this is you're also, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I kind of picked up on something there was you're also looking at how the LGBTQIA community is formed and banded together and been able to sort of move through the decades to where they are today, in terms of like committed, very aligned, consistent kind of community movement. Because I was at our like in the city I'm in, there was a Pride Fest yesterday.
Yeah.
I mean, I think back to where sort of in Edmonton, I mean, like I lived in Australia in like the mid 90s. And I mean, I was just, like 21-year-old guy from Canada, and walking through downtown Sydney and King's Cross with like 6 drag queen bars and lots of gay bars. Like that was, for me, like in Sydney, it was like, this is kind of normal. Like this is, Canada was very far behind in that regard. And so now I kind of see they've gone in Canada from like, pride parades, this kind of one-day event, to now like doing the Pride Month, like in Edmonton. Every day there was some sort of event capped off with this festival. which was like 11 in the morning till 11 at night. Lots, like drag queens, lots of music, lots of comedians, lots of sort of reflection on like people that have been mistreated by the law enforcement, or people that have been killed, like especially trans people, Black trans people that have kind of died. Very big Indigenous following as well. Like I think a lot of the drag queens were from various Indigenous communities here in Alberta. So yeah, like that community is gone. Like they're very well organized, and they are relentless, and they are getting tons of funding because I think there's so much support out there, and they're able to do these kind of events that are really bringing attention to them. So I'm very fascinated, in hearing about how that's good to know that you're looking at their community development practices.
Yeah,
it is a great use case, right, in that sense.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is the thing, like, so I totally agree. I think, over the past 2 decades, we have seen a much greater kind of community organizing, and this has been born out of, the work that primarily Black trans women started kind of in the Stonewall movement back in New York in the 70s or 60s. And it really started there. It started as a protest. It started as a protest against police brutality. It started as a protest against, kind of places of community gathering for this particular part of society constantly being harassed and mistreated by law enforcement. And I think that's important. We've got to remember that pride isn't, as much as it is fun, and obviously there are aspects of it that are a celebration of individuality, of people being able to express themselves in ways that they want to and not fear any kind of negative recriminations. I think we also do need to remember that this is a protest movement. This is a protest for rights, for liberties, for the very kind of essence of what we as humans should be able to expect on a day-to-day basis. And we've only seen the actions in the United States over the past couple of days with the repeal of Roe v. Wade, and then one of the justices released a kind of a comment on that, saying that we should now start looking at LGBTQIA plus rights and kind of whether we can withdraw those. So, this is a community that has been born through, and I identify as part of that community as well. I identify as queer, and this is, a community that's been born through hardship and struggles and, a challenge. And I think, if you look at things like the HIV/AIDS pandemic back in the 80s, and you look at how the community had to come together because mainstream society weren't helping at all. Politicians failed us, normal civil society failed us in terms of kind of general civil society, and actually, for the queer men who were dying of AIDS, lesbian women stepped in and were the ones who cared for that community because no one else would. So, as an overall community, I think there are lots of lessons that can be learned throughout society more generally around how, communities do find solidarity in each other and can move forward with a common cause because there is a need to. And I think in the aftermath of a disaster or an emergency, that need is very, very clear. It comes more than any other time, I think.
Well, it was interesting yesterday too to see the organizers and the MCs, like they also used that as an opportunity to educate the new members of the community and saying exactly what you said. They went back as far as saying this started as a riot, and then it turned into a protest, and they spent a great deal of time of educating sort of the younger crowd who maybe doesn't have that sense of history on exactly how they got there today. And so I think it's a very powerful way to, teach your community about the history so they can be better off in terms of understanding the background of where things came from, which in the end makes them a little bit more committed.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think, we're still seeing now, and this is the thing, like, we can always look at kind of, well, times were worse back then, and they, absolutely were. But I think all we need to do now is look at how the discussion around trans rights is being debated, particularly in the UK. UK is, for anyone kind of not based in the UK, is really being taken over by a, well, not taken over. It's a very vocal minority of queer people who are kind of arguing that they don't see why trans people are included within that community. And this debate around kind of us having to come together as a community to stop this type of hate and this bigotry is still happening now. 2022, and we are still having conversations around people's very basic way of life and their visibility and their right to exist. So, yes, it was worse, but I think, even now, like even today, we're still having, multiple struggles in terms of kind of mainstreaming some of the rights and the liberties that we as individuals should all be able to expect, regardless of who we love or how we identify.
Yeah, and I think it struck me too when I was just kind of hanging back watching some of the shows, and it was a very peaceful atmosphere. There was nobody there looked or dressed the same. Like, it was a very open experience. And then I saw 4 Edmonton police officers walk through the crowd in their uniforms, and I was kind of struck by this idea of now you just turned this environment into these 4 authoritative figures walking through, and it kind of just hit me as that was really unpleasant. And I understand the need for security at events and things like that, but I kind of had a thought in my head, does law enforcement really need to be outfitted in their body armor and have all of their stuff kind of creating this presence almost of watch yourselves because we are here. And then it led me to kind of thinking, wouldn't it be cool if law enforcement had the big kitted body armor cops out on the outskirts at the entry points, off to the side, but then the law enforcement then comes in to the festival to kind of just wander around. Why can't they be maybe toned down a little bit? Right.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole large portion of kind of LGBTQI plus people who have an issue with law enforcement being involved in Pride at all. And if you think, going back to those examples I used before, the Stonewall riots, I think that's understandable, and the queer community and gender minority community have traditionally been marginalized, othered, harassed, treated very, very unfairly by law enforcement officials, by people in positions of power. And I think it does need a lot more discussion around why there needs to be that presence in the first place. I think this goes back to kind of a very overall, regardless of what marginalized group we're talking about, this distrust of authority figures and this distrust of people in positions of power, because marginalized groups traditionally have been that's part of the reason they're marginalized. That's part of the reason why their vulnerability, their risks, their exposure are considerably greater than mainstream society. And the report that myself and Holly, my colleague, launched, we last year, we talked about this, and we talked about this lack of kind of trust by the LGBTQI plus community police and law enforcement officials. And I think it's definitely something that needs more investigation and a lot of work on the part of law enforcement. I'm not suggesting that I'm not suggesting that the queer community has done anything wrong. They haven't. This is I think it's a really difficult situation, but I do think there needs to be lots of lessons learned around how historically that community has been treated, and what police enforcement communities and organizations can do to start to repair and rebuild that trust, because at the moment and in the aftermath of a disaster, when those types of roles become very, very clear, I think that's where it kind of can get quite tricky and quite dangerous.
Yeah. So going back to the discussion around disasters, what are some of the things that you're finding that need to be incorporated in sort of like the traditional community, like a municipality, town, city? Mm-hmm. Like what do people in those local governments who work in disaster risk reduction or work in emergency management, disaster management, what can they be doing to kind of support this? Is it like engaging? It's probably engaging more with the LGBTQIA community, but what other things can you kind of advise on? Where can people start if they're not engaged with that community yet?
Yeah, I mean that you mentioned the kind of the big recommendation that we make is really engagement and is visibility of that community within the process of developing policy and practice around how we respond to disasters and emergencies. I always use the example of if you've got a room full of heterosexual white men, and you're developing policy for ethnic minority disabled woman, how are you going to understand the specifics that person needs or requires in the aftermath of a disaster? And unless you have aspects of all of society within that process, you're always going to fall short. And one of the other recommendations we make is, and this kind of comes in on how to kind of do that. And obviously, it's great saying all of these things, but actually, unless you're providing steps on how people can actually do it, it's kind of useless. But what we suggest is that you work with communities. And again, this comes back to that issue of trust. By reaching out and by engaging with community organizations, grassroots organizations, NGOs, the people who are focused specifically on the community that you want to engage with, you start to build up some of that trust, but you also have input from people who really understand the types of vulnerabilities, the types of capacities, the types of skills and resources each community will bring to an emergency management or disaster risk reduction process. So outreach is a huge part of it. Like, it's probably the big piece, particularly for small or smaller kind of towns and cities that might not have, say I'm based in London, and London does have a kind of a very solid process of engaging with a number of marginalized groups as a city. But obviously for smaller ones who might kind of just be embarking on this process, that's kind of a good first step. But we also, sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just gonna, I was thinking too, just as you were saying that, like where I am, Edmonton, London, Toronto, Vancouver, it's not to say that they are safer spaces, but they are definitely more progressive in the sense that people are in the LGBTQIA community are maybe a little bit more likely to be able to come out and join in those engagement sessions, because it's a big city. There's, you're not necessarily going to walk into a meeting and everyone's going to know who you are. Whereas in a small community where you might have not come out yet, or you maybe just don't interact with some people, it's not quite as safe for you to go to like a little community hall in those engagement sessions. So it's kind of overcoming that as well, I guess, eh?
Yeah, it is, and absolutely. And I mean, you kind of reminded me to make another point. And all of the conversation we've had today is around LGBTQI plus people in countries where it is legal to identify as such. Obviously emergency managers, disaster risk reduction practitioners working in countries that have laws against same-sex relationships, against gender minorities, etc. Obviously the situation becomes much more difficult, and the process in which inclusion, visibility, and engagement of this particular part of society happens adds a whole new layer of difficulty onto how you would go about doing that.
Yeah, that's a good point. That yeah, there are still a lot of countries where it's illegal.
Yeah.
To be other than like cisgender.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. And yes, cisgender heterosexual. I think that there, and this is the thing, and this is where kind of community groups and that kind of community action really does start to come into its own again, because all you need to do is look at countries. There are some countries in sub-Saharan Africa which have got really very, very harsh laws against even including the death penalty in some situations against LGBTQIA plus people, and yet even with that kind of that fear and that danger, there are community groups who are providing assistance and response, and the kind of the first responders effectively for this part of the community. It's all of what we're saying. We've been discussing so far. You and I are very fortunate to live in relatively liberal, free countries, but obviously there are a whole host of people out there who are working in much more challenging circumstances.
Yeah, and it's sort of, I guess, too, like one, it's like leading the way for countries where it still is illegal to be gay, and then kind of supporting them in developing these sort of, I don't want to call them underground networks, but I mean, for lack of a better term, I guess they kind of do have to be underground in that sense. It's how do you, what can you provide to them in terms of resources and tools that they can learn from to develop these supportive communities where they are trying to basically hide out from the law, hide out from government. So yeah.
I mean, there are a number of organizations that kind of do work with these particular communities in countries where it might be illegal to do so. I'm sure you might have heard of them anyway. There's an organization called Outright International, who do some incredible work on a global basis, really kind of, and not within DRR. They don't really kind of have any kind of specific DRR or emergency management response kind of team or action. They're much more about kind of, community resilience in the broadest sense of the term. They do some really great work in terms of working with grassroots organizations within those communities and within those countries where it's more difficult or impossible to be openly gay or non-gender conforming. So there's a whole host of organizations out there already that are doing some really good work. But yeah, I mean, the difficulty of engaging with those communities, unless you have that kind of intermediary, it's just because then again, how do people trust that you are genuine? How do people within those organizations know that they can, reach out? Because that could end up with them, having some very severe punishments or
well, sure. I would imagine a lot of them probably are thinking like, is this an organization set up by my government to catch me?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's been done, that unfortunately has, those kind of entrapment type situations, they're very common in places in certain countries around the world. I think, what we can do is provide information that's freely available on the web, kind of hoping that they have access to that, whether that's through kind of VPNs or kind of other ways to kind of mask the information that they're accessing. But again, a lot of the work that we do, or particularly my organization does, we are sitting in the UK, we're sitting in a country that I won't understand what that's like, as a white man also, this is a kind of another additional people of color who identify as queer and non-binary or genderqueer, they have a whole host of extra hurdles and vulnerabilities and exposure that needs to be considered when we're developing policy, because me as a white cis man, again, won't be able to understand what that process is like, and supporting organizations out there that are working with queer and gender minority people of color, I think is something that we all need to do more of, and really kind of engage with and support and learn from wherever we can.
Yeah, and I'm trying to, I think in Canada, right, like we kind of split out like emergency management and emergency social services. Like we split them out, but they're not really split out. I mean, they're still all connected. But I'm just wondering, like, I haven't come across, and it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I haven't come across any specific programming or in training or engagement, especially on the emergency social services side, that would look at this subject. And I'm just wondering, I would imagine, and I don't even know, like I'd have to check with like a Toronto or Vancouver, maybe even, I don't think Edmonton or Calgary would, but I'd have to check to see kind of what those cities are doing to engage the LGBTQIA community.
Specifically within kind of ethnic minorities, or do you mean just more broadly?
Broadly, and just considering, like, okay, let's just say, part of Toronto is, well, let's use Vancouver, right? Like a big earthquake. What do those emergency social services look like for the gay community? Like, what specifically do they need that a white, a family doesn't require or requires? Like, so it's either in terms of resources, in terms of mental health support, because it's kind of like, I always ask this to women I interview, because I don't know what it's like to be a woman in the workplace. And women in the workplace have a whole other set of stressors and things going on that impact their ability to perform over. So, for example, less pay, not being recognized as a credible source, maybe being spoke over, maybe their ideas are not, are kind of not being recognized and then picked up by, men and then used. Whereas myself as a white man, I don't necessarily have some of those same problems. So that creates a whole other level or onion of stress layers on women over myself. And then I think if you have, a gay Black woman, like there's a whole other layer, multiple layers of stress and things that are going on for them. And if we're not in tune to all those layers, we're not really able to support them very well, because we're not addressing all of the things that are going on for them.
No, absolutely not. And you mentioned kind of at the start of that point of the conversation, you mentioned about families seeking, shelter, and that's kind of a really good example, because if you have a same-sex family, if you have a family with children and two same-sex parents, unless the policy specifically dictates that they are allowed to be within the same unit in the aftermath of a disaster, then that can lead to some really real problems, because many emergency managers, people who are kind of on the front line of dealing with that response, might not recognize that that's a traditional family unit, and therefore can be split up. There are a whole kind of host of considerations that we as policymakers and practitioners need to think about in terms of first response, in terms of how aid and resource is given to people. Because the kind of the traditional 2.4 children, family, one, kind of one of each sex, that's not the only definition of a family. And if we as professionals are trying to develop policy that's inclusive of all, which we should be, because society is, is more diverse than just heterosexual people and just cisgender people. We need to make sure that those types of eventualities are addressed, and we have seen time and time and time again that they aren't. All you need to do is look back to as recently as, say, Hurricane Katrina in the States. You see multiple examples of same-sex couples being turned away as a family unit because they weren't recognized by the people who were running the shelter. You see examples of transgender people not being able to use the facilities that they need to be able to use. There are a whole number of these very kind of urgent things that we need to look at in our plans and in our way of going about responding to a disaster, that unless we do, really does further marginalize communities who are already super marginalized anyway.
Yeah, I remember back in my days of doing disaster recovery and disaster recovery grant development. Like our federal government, like you'd have indigenous people in a community. Like there could be 3 families in one house. And so the policy said, well, one house is for a family. How could they need 12 beds? Right. So we're only going to give them 4. And so you would often see that in the policy where it didn't take an account for, well, on a First Nations reserve, you are having 4 or 5 families living together, and the basement might have 8 beds in the basement. And if it's flooded and they only get 1 back, well, just, like you can't recover.
No.
And then you're compounding, because of a disaster, you're compounding, they probably had it better off before the disaster, but you're compounding it even worse now. And you're really setting them back. And I see that, like I remember with the federal government, it took so long for them to recognize traditional indigenous regalia as sort of a necessity, right? Whether it be like a hoop dancing regalia or, the actual hoops. They were like, well, we're not going to reimburse you. We're not going to reimburse them for costumes. Well, when they're not costumes, they make, exactly. They earn a livelihood through this dance and through performing for their community. And I just remember it took so many years to actually, as a white guy in the government, to kind of get people to kind of see the other side of this. And so I can only imagine what it's like for other groups that don't have that same privilege to get any kind of movement. So it's great to see your initiative in this, getting that information out, putting out those good practices, getting down to like actionable ways of working and developing policy so other communities can kind of take it and then tailor it to their needs. Yeah. Right. That's really what you're doing.
Yeah, and if the documents that we provide and the information that we provide doesn't cover everything, then my advice would be speak to the communities who are trying to develop policy.
Yeah,
that's probably if this entire thing could be shortened down to 1 sentence, I think that would be it. Stop trying to guess what you think communities need and actually ask the communities what they want and how they can help and what capacities they can bring to that process. Because if we do that, we'll have a much, much better emergency response process overall for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder too, it's kind of like almost with some of the organizations, local governments specifically, maybe even like our provincial governments here in Canada and territories.
Sure.
Like there's pockets of really good engagement with some groups. And then there's other groups and other divisions or branches in government that are not doing a great job at all. And it always makes me wonder, like, Like, what is really the gap in these government departments from learning from each other to kind of say, look, we were able to engage, the disabled community to develop this program. Here's how we did it. Here's how you can do it. But those conversations don't take place, I think. At least in my experience, it was really hard to engage internally first, let alone trying to get external support.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's the same in the UK. You know, I worked for 3.5 years in Public Health England before the pandemic, but it was still as an organisation and actually government overall, the British government, you know, it has a very siloed way of working, and even though there will be some organisations out there who are doing some fantastic work with marginalised groups, even on emergency preparedness, on disaster preparedness, that information won't be shared for whatever reason. And you know, I think if you kind of taking that time I spent in public health, you know, if you look at specifically LGBTQI plus community, you know, public health is it's probably kind of one of the areas of central government that does. Maybe in the UK or even in England, does a really good job of outreach, does a really good job of working with a community to engage that community, you know, with things like HIV testing and reproductive health rights, etc., and recognition of that. And I think you know, those lessons could be learned across the entire government and the entire kind of response system for disasters. But because of that siloed approach, because of the way they work, and you know, there aren't these kind of linkages that should be feeding in on an automatic basis, those lessons are missed. And then it's almost like you have to reinvent the wheel to do something that another department's already done and it's done really well, because you have a very specific way of working within your department.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree. I think that's probably, I would imagine that's probably a problem across the globe. You know, like every department has a very different way of working, and that doesn't necessarily always translate to good working elsewhere.
Yeah, and it. So I guess kind of where I was hoping to go to with this is, like, where do people go to kind of, like, they can join on your Twitter feed. Mm-hmm. You probably have like a DRR Dynamics website.
Yep.
And you've got a conference coming up in September. Tell us a little bit about the conference and kind of what the aim of that is too.
Sure. So the conference isn't about inclusive DRR, although it is in a way. Yeah. So the conference is around the campaign around no natural disasters, which tries to kind of educate people around the fact that disasters aren't natural. They have, you know, systemic, social, economic, cultural roots that creates a disaster out of a hazard, when actually we have the ability and the systems and the power to be able to stop that hazard becoming a disaster. And that does kind of engage quite closely with the inclusive DRR movement, because obviously people in positions of power are the ones who are making these decisions that put traditionally marginalized groups in areas of risk, you know, in situations that are more risky than others. So that conference is happening in September. I mean, for people who wanted to find out more specifically around inclusive DRR and kind of even more specifically LGBTQI plus groups, I would recommend, again, like you say, the Twitter account's a really good way of getting in kind of engaged with that discussion. But also there are a whole host of academics and researchers working around the world on this particular topic, and really it's kind of trying to find the researcher that's kind of is closest to you in terms of what it is that you're doing. Reach out to them and engage with them, but also reach out to those communities who are working on the ground, the grassroots organizations who are specifically focused on queer and gender minority communities. So yeah, I mean, there's there are steps, and you can always reach out to me directly and contact if you have a specific question. If anyone's watching and they want to contact me directly, then my DMs on Twitter are open, so please do feel free to message me.
So what is it that you need, or you as, and I don't know if you coin yourself like an academic or a researcher or whatever, like what is it that you need from the community to kind of keep moving forward and sort of progress what you're doing?
I mean, kind of a visibility that this particular marginalized group has, different vulnerabilities and capacities that need to be addressed. So I think that's kind of the big one in terms of, if you're a policymaker, if you're an emergency manager, if you're kind of in some position that kind of feeds into this process of dealing with the aftermath of a disaster or even preparing for a disaster, I think a recognition that this community exists and they need some considering and engaging with, I think would be, if everyone does that, that would be awesome. Like that would, get the ball rolling straight away. But if I can be more specific, it would be research. There are a huge number of gaps around how queer people and gender minority people are affected by disasters, how they respond to disasters, how they prepare for disasters. And we need funded research around that, because there isn't that much happening at the moment. There's a huge amount of work going on other marginalized groups, those with disabilities, women and girls, etc. And absolutely there should be. But we also need to recognize that there are other marginalized groups that aren't getting anywhere near that amount of attention. So, visibility in terms of your own work and what it is that you do on a day-to-day, but also research and funded research as well. Try not to expect people to do this research for free. Try and find some budget to pay communities, to pay organizations to do some research for you, to understand better how your community needs to be represented in the aftermath of an emergency.
Yeah, I always wonder if how can government support that acquisition of funding? Not saying that the government should fund everything, but how can governments support the acquisition of that funding? And I don't know if it's maybe through, I don't know if you've got any good examples, but I'm trying to think of when I was the director of preparedness for Alberta Emergency Management Agency, I didn't have an unlimited budget. And I never really thought about, my role in securing funding from outside of government. At least I don't remember, kind of thinking about that. And so I'm just curious if you've ever come across examples where there have been those kind of public-private partnerships. It's easy to say, yeah, in my province, Alberta government partners with the University of Alberta to fund this research, but at the end of the day, the government is giving money. But what about those sort of private sector organizations that could also fund that? What role could government play in securing that funding, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, I think I don't have any good examples of that, because it's kind of the holy grail, isn't it, of research, of finding somewhere, of finding a department, whether that be government or kind of elsewhere, that is willing to cough up the money. I think probably my only kind of contribution to that discussion would be the recognition that the more we understand about how marginalized groups are impacted by disasters, the overall better response we will have, because as a society we will be more prepared, and therefore it will reduce the costs of responding to a disaster. I think there's a figure that the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction kind of puts out every now and again. It's I think for every $1 spent on preparedness, you save $7 in response. And I think that kind of, even though again it's quite simplistic, that's the kind of attitude we need. And again, this goes into a whole new discussion around politics and funding of disaster research and emergency management. But the idea is solid in that the more we understand about how marginalized groups are impacted by and recover from disasters, the more we can do to help that recovery and that that kind of understanding before the disaster even strikes, which would lessen the costs for a department overall in terms of responding to a community that doesn't really understand the needs and capacities that that community has. So I don't have any good examples, but that's always, if someone asks me, well, it's great you saying that, but how do we pay for that? Well, money can be found, and obviously, budgets are super stretched. I get that, and obviously, particularly after the pandemic, everything's even more difficult. But I think, if we don't spend the money now, we're going to end up spending it after the disaster anyway, and we'll be spending a lot more of that money. And I think the case needs to be made by people like me and you, who are in positions where we're able to argue for those types of initiatives, to say this is going to save us money in the long run if we know how to engage with communities like the LGBTQIA plus community in disasters, and we understand exactly what it is that they need, because then that's going to save money when a disaster, unfortunately will happen.
Yeah, and it's it's that question right now, where is all that money? I think it's, there is a lot of money out there, but I think it's also being hoarded by various very large global entities, shareholders. Like it's kind of like, I don't quite understand it in terms of, organizations or communities saying, there's not enough money for that. Well, there is. It's just, it's being hoarded, I think. I don't know if hoarded's the right word to use, but I mean, I think about in Canada, I don't know what the price of fuel is in the UK right now or in England, but we're sitting at about $2 a liter in Alberta. Because fuel's always been high in the UK, right?
Yeah, I think traditionally we've had higher fuel rates than maybe the US and Canada has. Yeah,
so we're seeing like a 98% increase since the war in Ukraine started and the pandemic. And the government, Alberta government, has basically removed the tax gas, so we're seeing 13 cents a liter come off, but the oil companies, the gas companies, are still making a profit. They're still getting paid full price for their product. And it's like, at what point do we kind of stand up and say to these companies, look, you need to contribute as well, and maybe knock some profits off your margins a little bit, because that's where a lot of that money is going. And then it gets hoarded up into shareholders, and they save it, throw it in their bank accounts, and it never gets back out into the communities again. So that's just my own little personal rant, but
I mean, it's true though. That's
true,
thing,
right?
Like the whole disaster risk reduction funding system is broken. Firstly, we shouldn't be funding a response. We should be funding before the disaster even happens. We should be trying to prepare to reduce those risks, and it should be that it's not kind of a political short-sightedness. It's obviously politicians are elected with like 4 or 5 year terms. They will fund something that they think is going to help their career or going to help with that kind of their political ambition of the party or whatever it may be. But that shouldn't be the way we are funding disaster response. It should be a purely humanitarian, for the good of society approach. But obviously that's not how it works, and the system is without a doubt broken. I think we're skirting into another issue that deserves like an entire hour of its own time, to be honest.
Yeah, it is. It's that political discussion right now around the global politics, right? And like you said, about short-term thinking, because that's what's going to keep somebody in power. And I remember here in Canada, in Manitoba, I can't remember if it was the 60s or 70s, like the premier of Manitoba at the time took millions of dollars to dig a mitigative sort of water channeling structure around the city of Winnipeg. And they acquired a lot of farmland for it. I don't know what the price tag is, but back in the 60s, like, $10-15 million was a lot.
Sure.
People hated him for it. He didn't get elected again. They call it Duff's Ditch. So it's this big water diversion ditch around this city, and it has saved the province of Manitoba and Canada billions of dollars over the last 50 years in flooding damage. But the guy at the time, one-term premier, I think, got fired. Well, didn't get voted in because he had taken $10 million and a lot of farmland to build this ditch that nobody saw any value in.
Yeah.
But today he's like a provincial hero almost.
And that's the thing, does the funding of disasters, it shouldn't be an immediate thing. It shouldn't be to see immediate benefits, particularly with climate change. Climate change,
Yeah.
That's going to have a contribution to how exposed we are to these types of hazards, and that's long term. Well, maybe not even long term anymore, but over decades, maybe. It's not going to be an immediate results putting in a flood barrier and things like that. So, yeah, the kind of the process of how we fund disasters, I think, in the UK and across Europe and in North America, is flawed, massively flawed.
Oh yeah, and I'll just note, like, if you're watching us live, and you've got any questions, like, definitely throw them in the chat. We'll be happy to answer anything. But I'm kind of writing a blog right now on disaster recovery grant assistance in Canada, because it is still today creating an environment that is suppressing Indigenous communities. Because when they when they are hit by a disaster or experience a disaster, this grant funding is still not enough, or it's still not the right policy to help the community recover. And that, again, just adds to that layers I talked about earlier of, well, this is the state they were in before. They've had a disaster. We should be able to help build them back better or support them. But the grant system in place actually does the reverse. And it's still that oppressive sort of federal government mandate from 150 years ago that says we shall take all the land and culture from the Indigenous peoples and make it our own. Like, they're still progressing that agenda today, even though, they'll tell you they're not. They still are, because the legislation in Canada, the Indian Act, is still alive and well and progressing that movement. And it's I think like to your point earlier, it's the same across all these other marginalized types of groups. The system is broken. The system does not allow for decent consultation and engagement, and it's just not being funded well. Right, those conversations are not being had. So, or they're not being constructive. Like, they're not good conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how are we supposed to make better policy if we're not having those conversations?
Yeah. So you've got the No Natural Disasters Conference coming up. We kind of went over how people can get in touch with you. What have we, what did we need to cover today that we haven't covered in your mind?
I think we've probably covered way more than we originally set out. I think
probably, yeah.
I think it's been a wide-ranging discussion, hasn't it? But yeah, no, there's nothing else from me that I wanted to discuss. I think, it's great that streams like this are happening, and having this kind of discussion and this discourse, I think, is, it's a really positive step. And that's one of the reasons why social media, one of the very few reasons why social media is so good, because it does allow these discussions to happen, where before social media, this would have been, this probably wouldn't have happened.
Right.
How would we have done this?
Yeah.
So it's great. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you.
Yeah, no, thank you for taking the time to come on, because it is, and I guess, I like to always ask, groups when they meet or after, like, where does this discussion continue right after this? So it's on through your Twitter feed. It's going to be, I don't know if you're going to be looking at more just specific inclusive DR events, but there might be a little bit of discussion at it at your No Natural Disasters conference.
Yeah.
Any other big plans on where this discussion is going to continue?
So we're going to have a kind of a discussion, I guess, like a stream a bit like this in July, that's discussing around a report that I launched last week with a colleague, again, Holly Segler, who I wrote the LGBT one with, and we're talking about how hyper-marginalized groups need to be considered in data collection for disaster risk reduction. So, and LGBTQIA plus people are included within that definition. So that will be happening in July, and I'll be posting details relatively soon on that. Cool. So yeah.
Okay, we'll watch out for that for sure.
Perfect.
All right, Kevin. Well, thank you for your time again. I'll get you to. You can just I'll let you know when we're off air, but sure. Just stick around for a second. We'll debrief.
Okay.
And like I always like to kind of end these with, thanks for watching. Thanks for tuning in. And as always, please make sure you just stay connected. All right. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.